Sarah Wilson stood motionless in front of her bedroom mirror, her trembling fingers fumbling with the clasp of her necklace. The delicate silver chain, adorned with a single pearl, had been a gift from her fiance, Jack, on their first anniversary. Now, as she prepared to say her final goodbye, the weight of it seemed almost unbearable. The call had come 3 days ago. Jack's sister, Melissa, her voice choked with tears, had delivered the devastating news. A car accident. Sudden. Fatal. The words had cut through Sarah like shards of glass, leaving her world shattered and colorless. She smoothed down her black dress, wondering absently when she had last worn it. A cousin's funeral? A colleague's parent? It didn't matter now. Nothing seemed to matter in a world without Jack. A soft knock at the door jolted her from her thoughts. "Sarah, the car's here," her mother's gentle voice called. "Coming," Sarah replied, her own voice sounding foreign to her ears. She took one last look in the mirror, barely recognizing the pale, hollow-eyed woman staring back at her. With a deep breath, she turned and walked out of the room, each step feeling like lead. The drive to the funeral home was a blur of gray skies and sympathetic glances. Sarah sat in the back seat of her parents' car, staring out the window but seeing nothing. Her mind kept replaying moments with Jack. His laugh, the warmth of his hand in hers, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled. How could he be gone? As they pulled up to the somber brick building, Sarah's heart began to race. This was it, the final goodbye. She had been dreading this moment, but a small part of her also longed for it. To see him one last time, to touch his face, to make it real. Because despite the constant ache in her chest, a tiny voice in her head kept insisting that this couldn't be happening. Melissa greeted them at the entrance, her eyes red-rimmed and puffy. She pulled Sarah into a tight embrace. "Thank you for coming," she whispered. "Jack would have wanted you here." Sarah nodded, unable to form words. She allowed herself to be led into the viewing room, her legs moving of their own accord. The room was filled with flowers, their sweet scent almost overwhelming. Soft, mournful music played in the background. And there, at the front of the room, stood the polished mahogany casket. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. This was wrong. All wrong. Jack should be here, holding her hand, comforting her as they mourned someone else, not lying cold and still in that box. With faltering steps, she approached the casket. Her parents and Melissa hung back, giving her space for this intimate moment. Sarah's hand shook as she reached out to touch the smooth wood. She closed her eyes, steeling herself for what she was about to see. "I love you, Jack," she whispered. "I'll always love you." Taking a deep breath, Sarah opened her eyes and looked down into the casket. The world stopped. The man lying there was not Jack. Sarah blinked hard, certain she must be hallucinating. But when she looked again, nothing had changed. The face was similar, same dark hair, same strong jaw, but it wasn't him. The nose was slightly too broad, the cheekbones not quite right. This was a stranger wearing her fiance's suit. "What?" Sarah's voice came out as a strangled whisper. She whirled around, her wide eyes finding Melissa. "This isn't Jack. Who is this man?" Melissa's face drained of color. For a moment, something that looked like panic flashed in her eyes before she composed herself. "Sarah, honey, I know this is hard. Grief can play tricks on our minds." "No," Sarah cut her off, her voice rising. "I know what Jack looks like. This is not him. What's going on?" The room had gone silent, all eyes on Sarah. Her parents exchanged worried glances, clearly unsure how to handle their daughter's apparent breakdown. But Sarah knew she wasn't crazy. As the initial shock wore off, her mind began to race. If this wasn't Jack, where was he? Was he really dead? And if not, why would Melissa lie? In that moment, staring at the imposter in the casket, and the fear poorly hidden in Melissa's eyes, Sarah knew one thing for certain. Nothing about this situation was what it seemed, and she was going to find out the truth, no matter what it took. Sarah's world spun as she stumbled out of the funeral home, gasping for air. The concerned voices of her parents and the startled murmurs of other mourners faded into background noise as she leaned against a nearby tree, her mind reeling. "Sarah, honey," her mother's gentle voice broke through the fog. "What's wrong? Talk to us." Sarah looked up, meeting her parents' worried gazes. How could she explain what she'd seen when she barely understood it herself? "That's not Jack in there," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I don't know who it is, but it's not him." Her father frowned, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Sweetheart, I know this is hard. Grief can do strange things to our perception." "No, Dad," Sarah interrupted, shaking her head vehemently. This isn't grief. I know Jack's face better than I know my own. That man in the casket is not him. Before her parents could respond, Melissa appeared, her face a mask of concern. Sarah, I'm so sorry. I should have prepared you better. The accident, it changed his appearance. The mortician did his best, but stop, Sarah said, her voice low and dangerous. Stop lying. That isn't Jack, and you know it. A flicker of something, fear, guilt, passed over Melissa's face before she composed herself. I understand this is overwhelming. Why don't we go somewhere quiet to talk? Sarah stared at her, searching for any sign of the woman she'd thought of as a sister for the past 3 years. All she saw was a stranger. I think I need some time alone, she said finally, turning to her parents. Can you take me home? The ride home was tense and silent. Sarah could feel her parents' concerned glances, but she kept her eyes fixed on the passing scenery, her mind working overtime. If that wasn't Jack in the casket, where was he? Was he truly dead, or was this all some elaborate hoax? And if so, why? As soon as they arrived home, Sarah retreated to her room, ignoring her parents' attempts to talk. She needed to think, to plan. Sitting at her desk, she opened her laptop and began to search. Hours passed as Sarah dug deeper and deeper. She started with Jack's social media accounts, noting that they had all gone silent 3 days ago, the day of the supposed accident. Next, she scoured news sites for any reports of local car crashes. Nothing matched the story Melissa had told her. As the sky outside darkened, Sarah's search took a new direction. She began looking into Melissa and Jack's background, something she realized she knew surprisingly little about. They had always been vague about their past, citing a difficult childhood they preferred not to discuss. It was well past midnight when Sarah stumbled upon something that made her blood run cold. A news article from 2 years ago, from a small town in Oregon. Local couple swindled out of life savings by charming con artists. The grainy photo accompanying the article showed two people who looked remarkably like Jack and Melissa, though the names were different. Sarah's heart pounded as she dug further. More articles, more towns, more victims. Always the same story, a charming brother-sister duo who ingratiated themselves into a community, gained people's trust, and then disappeared with their money. The pieces began to fall into place, forming a picture that Sarah didn't want to believe. Jack, or whatever his real name was, and Melissa were con artists. And now, for some reason, they were faking Jack's death. But why? And whose body was in that casket? Sarah's fingers flew over the keyboard as she searched for recent obituaries, looking for anyone who matched the description of the man she'd seen. After an hour of searching, she found him. Michael Delaney, 32, died 3 days ago in County General Hospital after a long illness. With shaking hands, Sarah reached for her phone. She hesitated for a moment before dialing the number listed in the obituary. It was nearly 3 a.m., but she couldn't wait. A groggy female voice answered on the fourth ring. Hello? I'm so sorry to call at this hour, Sarah said, her voice trembling. Is this the Delaney family? Yes, who is this? Sarah took a deep breath. My name is Sarah Wilson. I think I may have some information about your son, Michael. There was a pause on the other end of the line. What kind of information? I believe, Sarah swallowed hard. I believe his body may have been stolen. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, in a voice filled with confusion and growing anger, Mrs. Delaney said, What are you talking about? Who are you? Sarah closed her eyes, steeling herself for what she was about to do. I'm so sorry, Mrs. Delaney. This is going to sound crazy, but please, I need you to listen. And then, if you're willing, I need your help to uncover the truth and bring those responsible to justice. The next morning dawned gray and misty, mirroring Sarah's tumultuous state of mind. She had barely slept, her conversation with Mrs. Delaney replaying in her head. The woman's initial disbelief had given way to shock, then a quiet, simmering anger. They had agreed to meet later that day to discuss their next steps. Sarah moved through her morning routine in a daze, dodging her parents' concerned questions with vague reassurances. She couldn't involve them, not yet, not until she had concrete proof. As she sipped her coffee, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Melissa. We need to talk. Meet me at Riverside Park at noon. Sarah's heart raced. Did Melissa suspect she was on to them? Or was this a chance to get answers? After a moment's hesitation, she replied with a simple, Okay. The park was quiet when Sarah arrived, the overcast sky keeping most visitors away. She spotted Melissa sitting on a bench near the river, her posture tense. "Sarah," Melissa said as she approached, her voice strained. "I'm glad you came. We need to clear the air about yesterday." Sarah sat down, keeping a careful distance between them. "Yes, we do," she said coolly. "Why don't you start by telling me the truth?" Melissa's eyes widened slightly before she composed herself. "I know you're grieving, Sarah. Sometimes our minds play tricks on us when we're in pain." "Stop!" Sarah interrupted, her voice hard. "I know about Oregon and Arizona and all the other places you and Jack have left broken lives behind." The color drained from Melissa's face. For a moment, she looked like she might run. Then her shoulders slumped, and when she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "How did you find out?" "It doesn't matter," Sarah said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "What matters is that you tell me the truth. All of it. Where's Jack? Is he really dead?" Melissa's laugh was hollow. "Jack? There is no Jack. There never was. His real name is Daniel, and he's my partner, not my brother." The confirmation, even though Sarah had suspected it, felt like a physical blow. She took a shaky breath. "So it was all a lie? Everything?" "Not everything," Melissa, or whatever her name was, said softly. "He did love you, Sarah. That's why we had to leave. You were making him want to change, to give up the life. I couldn't let that happen." Sarah's mind reeled. "So you faked his death? Why? And whose body did you steal?" Melissa's eyes widened in genuine surprise. "Steal a body? What are you talking about?" Before Sarah could respond, a commotion near the park entrance caught their attention. 2 police cars had pulled up, and officers were heading in their direction. Melissa jumped to her feet. "I'm sorry, Sarah. I truly am." And with that, she turned and ran, disappearing into the trees before Sarah could react. Moments later, the police reached her. "Sarah Wilson?" one officer asked. At her nod, he continued, "We need you to come with us. We have some questions about a body that's gone missing from County General Hospital." As Sarah was led to the police car, her mind raced. She had set these events in motion by contacting Mrs. Delaney, but now she realized she was in over her head. The truth was more complicated than she had imagined, and she was caught in the middle of something much bigger than a relationship built on lies. At the police station, Sarah found herself in an interrogation room facing 2 detectives. She took a deep breath and began to tell her story, starting with the funeral and ending with her meeting in the park. The detectives exchanged glances as she finished. "Ms. Wilson," the older one said, "you've stumbled into an ongoing investigation. The couple you know as Jack and Melissa are wanted in several states for fraud and theft. We've been tracking them for months." "But what about the body?" Sarah asked. "Do you know what happened to Michael Delaney?" The younger detective leaned forward. "That's where things get interesting. It seems that your Jack and Melissa aren't the only ones involved in this. We believe there's a larger organization at play, one that deals in black market organ trafficking." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. "Organ trafficking? But how is that connected to Jack and Melissa's cons?" "We think they were recruiters," the older detective explained. "They'd identify potential targets, not just for their cons, but for the organ trafficking ring. When they realized you were becoming a liability, they decided to fake Jack's death and disappear. But something went wrong. We believe," the younger detective continued, "that they were supposed to provide a body for the fake funeral. Likely someone who had died naturally, but whose organs could still be harvested. But for some reason, they failed to deliver. The organization took matters into their own hands and stole Mr. Delaney's body from the hospital." Sarah sat back, her mind struggling to process this information. The man she had loved, the future she had planned, it had all been a lie, a front for something far more sinister than she could have imagined. "Ms. Wilson," the older detective said gently, "we know this is a lot to take in, but we need your help. You're our best link to these people. Will you work with us to bring them down?" Sarah looked at the detectives, then down at her hands. The engagement ring Jack had given her glinted in the harsh fluorescent light. With a decisive motion, she slipped it off and placed it on the table. "Yes," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "I'll help you, whatever it takes." As the detectives began to outline their plan, Sarah felt a mix of emotions wash over her. Grief for the relationship she had lost, anger at the betrayal, fear of what was to come. But underneath it all, a steely determination took root. She would see this through, not just for herself, but for all the victims, past and potential, of this corrupt organization. The path ahead was uncertain and fraught with danger, but Sarah was ready to face it. The truth had shattered her world, but in its wreckage, she would build herself anew, stronger, wiser, and unafraid. Over the next few weeks, Sarah's life transformed into something unrecognizable. Her days were filled with meetings at the police station, poring over files, and learning the intricacies of the investigation. Nights were spent tossing and turning, her dreams haunted by faces she once trusted. The detectives, whom she now knew as Detective Rodriguez and Detective Chen, had brought her fully into the fold of their operation. They were part of a task force dedicated to bringing down the organ trafficking ring, which they believed spanned several states and had tentacles reaching into hospitals, funeral homes, and even some law enforcement agencies. Your involvement gives us an unprecedented opportunity, Detective Rodriguez explained during one of their strategy sessions. You're an unknown variable to them. They might reach out, try to ensure your silence. Sarah nodded, her stomach churning at the thought of further contact with Jack, Daniel, or Melissa. And if they do? Detective Chen leaned forward. That's when we set the trap. The plan they devised was risky, but potentially devastating to the organization. Sarah would play the role of a grieving fiance turned opportunist, someone who had figured out enough of the truth to be dangerous, but who could be bought off for the right price. The key, Detective Rodriguez emphasized, is to make them believe you're motivated by greed and self-preservation, not a desire for justice. We need them to think they can control you. Sarah spent hours with a behavioral analyst, learning how to modulate her voice, control her expressions, and project the right mix of fear and avarice. It was exhausting, forcing her to confront the depths of her own pain and channel it into something useful. 2 months after the funeral that wasn't, Sarah's phone rang with an unknown number. Her heart raced as she answered, knowing who it must be. Sarah? The voice was achingly familiar. Jack, no, Daniel. She took a steadying breath before responding, her voice carefully calibrated to sound nervous but greedy. I was wondering when you'd call. We have a lot to talk about. There was a pause on the other end. Yes, we do. I hear you've been asking questions, making waves. That's dangerous, Sarah. Not as dangerous as what you're involved in, she countered. I know about the organ trafficking, Daniel, or do you prefer Jack? Another pause, longer this time. When he spoke again, his voice was colder. What do you want? Sarah steeled herself. This was the moment everything hinged on. What everyone wants. Money. Enough to disappear and forget I ever knew you. And if we give you this money, then I vanish. No more questions, no more digging. I'll be a ghost. The silence stretched out, and Sarah fought to keep her breathing even. Finally, Daniel spoke. I'll be in touch with details. Don't do anything stupid in the meantime. The line went dead. Sarah let out a shaky breath, then quickly dialed Detective Rodriguez. It's done, she said. They took the bait. The next week was a flurry of activity. The task force set up surveillance equipment in Sarah's apartment and prepared for every possible scenario. Sarah herself felt like a coiled spring, tense and ready to snap at any moment. When the call came with instructions for the money drop, everything was in place. Sarah followed the directions to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, her every move monitored by the hidden task force. As she stepped into the dim interior of the warehouse, Sarah's resolve was tested. There, standing in a pool of weak sunlight filtering through a dirty skylight, was Daniel. The sight of him, alive, real, so achingly familiar, nearly broke her composure. Hello, Sarah, he said, his voice softer than she expected. I'm sorry it came to this. Sarah squared her shoulders, channeling all her hurt and anger into her performance. Save it. Do you have my money? Daniel nodded towards a duffel bag at his feet. It's all there, 2 million, as agreed. Now, about your part of the bargain. I'll disappear, Sarah said firmly. You'll never hear from me again. As she bent to pick up the bag, the warehouse erupted into chaos. Task force members swarmed in from every direction, shouting commands. Daniel's face contorted with shock and betrayal before he turned to run, only to be tackled by Detective Chen. In the aftermath, as Daniel and several other arrested members of the organization were led away, Detective Rodriguez approached Sarah. You did good, kid, really good. This bust will cripple their operation. Sarah nodded, feeling numb. What happens now? Now, now we start unraveling the whole thing. It'll be a long process, but thanks to you, we've got a real chance at shutting them down for good. As Sarah watched the police cars drive away, she felt a complex mix of emotions: relief, sadness, a tentative sense of triumph. The life she had known was gone, shattered beyond repair. But from the wreckage, she had salvaged something precious: her integrity, her strength, and the knowledge that she had made a difference. The sun was setting as Sarah left the warehouse, casting long shadows across the ground. She paused for a moment, watching the interplay of light and dark. Her own shadow stretched out before her, longer and somehow stronger than she remembered. With a deep breath, Sarah stepped forward into the fading light. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in months, she felt ready to face it. She had survived the unthinkable, had stared into the face of betrayal, and emerged stronger. Whatever came next, she would meet it head on. No longer a victim, but a force to be reckoned with. In the months following the bust, Sarah's life settled into a new rhythm. The initial media frenzy had died down, leaving her to navigate the quieter, more personal aftermath of her ordeal. She found herself spending long hours testifying in court, her words helping to build cases against not only Daniel and Melissa, but also against key figures in the organ trafficking ring. As autumn turned to winter, Sarah sat in yet another courtroom, watching as Daniel was sentenced. His eyes met hers briefly as he was led away, and she was surprised to find that the sight of him no longer made her heart race. Instead, she felt a complex mix of pity and resolve. Outside the courthouse, Detective Rodriguez approached her. "You did good in there, Sarah. Your testimony was crucial." Sarah nodded, pulling her coat tighter against the chill. "What happens now?" "Now, we keep working. This case opened up a whole network we didn't even know existed. It's going to take years to fully unravel." He paused, studying her face. "But that's our job. You've done more than enough. It's time for you to think about your own future." His words struck a chord. In the chaos of the investigation and trials, Sarah had put her own life on hold. Now, standing on the courthouse steps with the winter sun weak on her face, she realized she was free to move forward. Over the next few weeks, Sarah began to rebuild. She started by reaching out to old friends she had neglected during her relationship with Jack. No, Daniel. Many were understanding, rallying around her with support and love. Others, unable to reconcile the Sarah they knew with the woman they'd seen on the news, drifted away. Sarah learned to accept both reactions with grace. She also connected with Mrs. Delaney, the woman whose son's body had been at the center of the initial discovery. What started as a somber meeting over coffee grew into a friendship built on shared grief and a determination to effect change. Together, they started a support group for victims of fraud and their families, creating a space for healing and empowerment. As spring bloomed, Sarah made a decision. She had been toying with the idea of law school before meeting Daniel. And now, with a newfound passion for justice, she decided to pursue that dream. Her experiences had given her a unique perspective that she hoped to bring to her future career. The day she received her acceptance letter, Sarah walked to the park where she had last spoken to Melissa. She sat on the same bench, watching the river flow by, marveling at how much had changed in a year. A voice interrupted her reverie. "Ms. Wilson?" She looked up to see Detective Chen approaching. "Detective," she greeted him with a smile. "What brings you here?" He sat down beside her, his expression serious. "I wanted to give you an update in person. We've made some significant breakthroughs in the case. Several high-ranking members of the organization have agreed to testify in exchange for leniency. It looks like we might be able to bring down the entire network." "Weeden." Sarah let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. That's incredible news." Chen nodded. "It is, and it wouldn't have been possible without you. Your courage started this whole thing." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, watching a pair of ducks navigate the currents of the river. Finally, Sarah spoke. "I got into law school." Chen's face broke into a genuine smile. "Congratulations! That's wonderful news." Sarah paused, gathering her thoughts. "I think I want to specialize in victim advocacy. Maybe work with the DA's office someday." "You'd be great at that," Chen said warmly. "You have a unique perspective." As the detective stood to leave, he hesitated. "You know, we're always looking for good people in law enforcement. If you ever decide that's a path you're interested in..." Sarah smiled. "I'll keep that in mind. Thank you." As Chen walked away, Sarah turned back to the river. The water sparkled in the spring sunlight. its surface broken by ripples and eddies. She thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment, the pain, the betrayal, the hard-won victories. Each experience had shaped her, like water shaping stone, revealing strengths she never knew she possessed. She thought about the future stretching out before her, full of possibilities. Law school, a career fighting for justice, maybe even a return to love someday, when she was ready. The path wouldn't be easy, but she felt prepared to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Sarah stood, taking a deep breath of the crisp spring air. The woman who had sat on this bench a year ago, shattered by betrayal, was gone. In her place stood someone stronger, wiser, and fiercely determined to make a difference in the world. As she walked out of the park, Sarah felt a sense of peace settle over her. The chapter of her life that had begun with a lie was truly over. Now she was writing her own story, one of resilience, justice, and hope. Whatever the future held, she would face it with open eyes and an open heart, ready to embrace the challenges and joys that lay ahead. The sun was warm on her face as she stepped onto the bustling city street, merging into the flow of people. She was just one person among many, but she carried within her the power to create change. And that, Sarah realized, was the most valuable lesson of all.